relations between India and Pakistan have never been cordial. War after war, the tensions have only escalated. 1948, 1965 and 1971. Tensions between the two neighbors severed in the backdrop of the upsurge in Pakistan-sponsored militancy in Kashmir Valley in the early 1990s. And even more, after the nuclear test by both the countries in 1998. In order to defuse the situation, India and Pakistan signed the Lahore Declaration in February 1999 when Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee went on his maiden visit to Pakistan on board the newly launched Delhi-Lahore bus service. While this was making global headlines, in the operations room of Pakistan Army's GHQ, General Pervez Musharraf was planning a large-scale infiltration across the LOC to surreptitiously occupy dominating heights of Kargil. The infiltration was codenamed Operation Badr. Namaskar, you're watching In Focus with me, Ananya Raheja. 3 months after signing the declaration, Pakistan yet again backstabbed India. Pakistani troops were spotted in the northern sector of Ladakh by a shepherd and had captured a strategic and dominating location in the Kargil district overlooking the Srinagar-Kargil National Highway No. 1. The aim of the infiltration was to sever the link between Kashmir and Ladakh and force Indian forces to withdraw from the Siachen Glacier. Pakistan was also of the opinion that such a large-scale war will definitely garner international attention, which will, in turn, force India to demarcate Indian and Pakistani territories. Initially, Pakistan denied the involvement of its army in the war and claimed that it was caused by Kashmiri militants. However, documents left behind by war casualties, testimonies of prisoners of war, and later statements by Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif as well as Army Chief Pervez Musharraf told a different story. The Indian Army and the government was unaware of the large-scale invasion planned at the hands of Pakistan's army and the ISI. The shepherd immediately tipped off Headquarter 121 Infantry Brigade about the presence of intruders. Captain Saurabh Kalia and his men were the first ones to patrol the area after the tip-off. The men were taken captive by the Pakistani troops for 22 days, during which they faced unimaginable torture and their mutilated corpses were handed over to the Indian authorities. Captain Saurabh Kalia was the first prisoner of war of the Kargil conflict. It was on May 10th that Pakistani infiltrators penetrated into Dras and Kaksar sectors across the LOC. And this is when the Indian Army launched Operation Vijay. Some posts on the Indian side of the LOC were occupied by the Pakistani forces in as early as February of 1999, at the peak of winters when infiltration was least expected by the Indian Army and most strategic points along the LOC lay deserted owing to extreme temperatures. Troops from Pakistan's elite special services group and the Northern Light Infantry covertly and overtly set up bases on 132 vantage points on the Indian-controlled region. These Pakistani forces were reportedly backed by Kashmiri guerrillas and Afghan mercenaries. The bulk of inflation, however, occurred in April. The flow of information was negligible and the intelligence inputs were next to zero. It was concerted air reconnaissance which revealed that the infiltrators had occupied dominating heights and covered all approaches by observation and fire. The Indian Army had received particular directions to not cross the LOC at any cost, which limited the options to go in for frontal assaults. Around 2 lakh troops were mobilized, but the nature of the terrain made division and corps level operations impossible and fighting was conducted mostly at the brigade or the battalion level. About 30,000 troops were actively engaged in war in the Kargil-Dras sector. At such heights, the challenge is not just to fight the enemy, but also temporary memory loss and frostbite. Deployed in these tough conditions, the Indian Army guards the country's borders. On May 26, the Indian Air Force was called in to conduct air surveillance missions and airstrikes in order to help Indian Army advance towards the enemy, with strict instructions to not cross the LOC at any cost, fearing any undesirable escalation. Absolutely zero opposition by the Pakistani Air Force gave the Indian Air Force free passage to carry out its attacks with impunity. The Indian Navy too jumped into action as soon as it was asked to. As part of Operation Talwar, the western and the eastern fleets of the Navy came together in the northern Arabian Sea and threatened to cut Pakistan's sea trade, which exploited Pakistan's dependence on sea-based oil and trade. Later, Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif disclosed that in case a full-scale war breaks out, Pakistan will be left with just 6 days of fuel to sustain itself. Since the infiltrators had occupied strategic locations overlooking the Srinagar-Leh National Highway, securing these locations was the main task for the Indian Armed Forces. From their 130-plus covertly occupied observation posts, the Pakistani forces had a clear line of sight to lay down indirect artillery fire on National Highway 1, inflicting heavy casualties on the Indians. This posed a serious challenge for the Indian Army, as National Highway 1 was the main logistical and supply route and also the shortest route to reach Leh. Indian troops first targeted the Tiger Hill and Tololing in Dras sector, followed by Batalik Turtuk subsector, which provides key passage to the Siachen Glacier. The Battle of Tololing played decisive in turning the war in India's favor. As infiltrators stationed at Tololing were aided by Pakistani fighters from Kashmir. Some posts, however, put up stiff resistance, including Tiger Hill, where Indian troops came across well-entrenched Pakistani soldiers, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. Some peaks in these sectors, such as the .4590 and .5353, were of vital strategic importance to the Pakistani defensive troops. While .4590 was the closest to National Highway 1, .5353 was the highest feature in the Dras sector. The recapture of .4590 by the Indian Army on June 14th saw the maximum number of casualties in a single battle during the conflict. Once the vicinity of National Highway 1 was cleared of infiltrators, the Indian Army turned to driving the invading forces back across the LOC. To clear the infiltrators from posts that were in the line of sight, about 250 artillery guns were brought in, of which Bofors FH-77B field howitzer played a vital role in order to make maximum use of the terrain. However, outposts on many vital points who were out of visible range could not be dislodged either by artillery or by air power. This is when Indian Army mounted some direct frontal assaults which were slow and claimed many lives, given the steep climb on peaks as high as 5,500 meters or 18,000 feet. Avoiding daylight attacks owing to the danger involved, all advances were made in the cover of darkness, but this increased exposure to temperatures as low as -11 degrees Celsius to -15 degrees Celsius. 2 months into the conflict, Indian troops had slowly retaken most of the ridges that were encroached upon by the infiltrators. Official figures suggested an estimated 75 to 80% of the intruded area and nearly all the high ground were back under Indian control. As the war ended, morale of the Pakistani forces had declined sharply, as many units of the Northern Light Infantry had suffered heavy casualties. Their government even refused to accept the corpses of its soldiers. Initially, the casualties were not acknowledged, but later, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif admitted the loss of over 4,000 soldiers in the operation. The Indian side, however, saw 527 casualties and 1,363 injuries. Shortly after declaring itself a nuclear power in 1998, Pakistan had been humiliated and diplomatically and militarily faced with the possibility of international isolation. The already fragile Pakistan economy was weakened further.